Hi, it's been a while since I've made a video, and of late I've been making a lot of these things. These are late Neolithic, early Bronze Age daggers. They're also known as Beaker Daggers, though the word Beaker Daggers tends only to be applied to the larger ones. Smaller ones were made in this era as well. Prior to the late Neolithic, knives would have been made of taking blades from a conical blade core and usually retouching them on one side. They were called plano-convex or slug knives. There was no substantially large knives in Britain at that particular time, but around about the late Neolithic, early Bronze Age, bifacial knives started to appear. The bifacial knives started to appear around the same time as the beaker culture started to appear, so they're usually associated with the beaker culture. Now, the beaker culture is named after the pottery style, the bell beaker pottery style, but also other technology came with the bell beaker culture, and one of these technologies was metallurgy. It's still not known entirely whether these daggers appeared before or after metallurgy arrived, but a lot of people think they post-date metallurgy, and the reason for this is a lot of them had handles very similar to what you'd find on a copper or a bronze dagger. A copper or a bronze dagger would usually, in the early Bronze Age, just be a triangle like that, in a handle very similar to this. And one theory of the daggers is that they were knappers' response to the coming of metallurgy. Now, if you're a flint knapper and suddenly you're facing your livelihood completely wiped out, you would be very worried. It would be, for the knapping families, the coming of metalwork would be a great tragedy and a time of hardship. So, and what there is there's very good reason to believe, with the great improvement of stone technology during the Bronze Age, that the knappers upped their game to try and compete with metalwork. That's one theory. Another theory is that it was the actual metalwork enabled them to use copper tools, so their knapping improved because they were using copper tools. It could of course be both simultaneously. Now, I've looked at a lot of beaker daggers. They're around in museums. I've not actually seen any sign of metal or copper being used. To me, the flake scars all look like they were made from antler. So I'm not a big fan of the idea that copper was what enabled these daggers to come into existence. I tend to think that they were making them with antler. Many of them actually have notches, which is how they're locked into the handles, and the notches appear to be punch notched. These blades are so thick you wouldn't be able to pressure flake them with antler. So if you're going to use antler, you would punch notch them, and from ones that I've seen in history, they look, or in museums, they look punch notched again. They look like they were made with antler. Though, if you suddenly got copper, why would you move to pressure flaking if you're competent at punch notching? And they could easily have been punch notched with copper. In fact, I believe in the Heathrow Terminal 5 they found what might be a copper awl for flint knapping. So, what is their usage? And this is an interesting one. What the main theory, I think, around is that they were kind of for the middle classes. The rich or the super rich would have got shiny new copper or bronze daggers, or people who are good at plundering from the super rich would have got shiny new bronze daggers, and the middle classes would have got these daggers as a cheaper alternative. And that is one theory. I'm not the biggest fan of that theory for the reason that, as you say, bronze daggers would have been sort of that shape. They were stabbing weapons, but beaker daggers are quite rounded. They actually, I'll show you one in the book. These are some beaker daggers that have actually been found. If we see, they get thinner where you half them on the tang and get thicker at the top. So if they were imitations of copper daggers, surely the thin bit would be there and the thick bit would be hafted, and they'd be good stabbing weapons like the copper or bronze daggers, but they're not. And they don't appear, they're not going to be great weapons for killing people with. I mean, they're basically a large cutting blade, not a stabbing blade. Though the smaller ones are actually stabbing weapons, much more stabbing. But certainly the bigger ones don't look to be the equivalent in blade of the bronze or copper ones. So I'm not a big fan of the middle class theory. Second one is people have proposed they're actually used for hunting. What you could do is you could use these for delivering the coup de grace on animals. You've shot an animal with your bow, and then you can just cut the throat of the animal, and they'd be an excellent weapon for cutting the throats of animals, which is interesting because these are occurring in the late Neolithic Bronze Age. Why wouldn't they have made them in the Mesolithic hunter-gatherer era if they're so necessary for hunting? Another option is they were used for cutting throats, but it wasn't the throats of animals they were used cutting for cutting. It was, shall we say, for cutting the throats of people, and they were some kind of ritual sacrifice aid. And there's very few of these ever been found. So I mean, that is a viable explanation. But really, what they were used for is a great mystery. Unless some sort of test can be done and we look at the edges of the blades under microscopes of beaker daggers or find some residue of blood, I don't know what they are actually used for. Now, beaker daggers are probably the best example of bifacial daggers in Europe, with one exception, that being Danish daggers, which surpassed them. There's no real knowledge of how they were hafted in the UK, except for one dagger that seems to have a patina with rope marks or some sort of fibre marks where it was tied on, staying in the flint. But in Denmark they've got a few examples where they found out where they got the remains of the handles, and they all seem to be wood that was split in half and then carved out and tied tightly back together. As you can see, the split's nearly invisible. And this makes sense because then you could just unwind the string and resharpen it if you wanted to. I mean, you could probably resharpen it anyway without doing that. So as you can see, these are the beaker daggers I've made so far. This one is made from a lump of chert as opposed to flint. And the smaller ones. This is a nice two-tone grey-black piece of flint. I like that one. This is a small one, small leaf one. This one I love the bit of wood I found. Come out nice and nicely. This one I don't actually sell. I've had this one for a while. This is the only one I'm not actually selling. I keep this for myself because I just love that bit of wood. And this is a white or very light grey flint one. So that's Beaker Daggers.